Today, we are engaging with a document that really takes a wrecking ball to some of the most fundamental ideas about identity and history in the Americas, packed with research, and I have to say, it's pretty revolutionary.
Titled Reclaiming Indigenous Identity and Sovereignty, a Practical Guide,
Hmm.
directly confronts the colonial record on identity and displacement.
Which is that millions of people who are currently identified by colonial labels like African American, Black, or Negro are actually indigenous to these lands.
And the guide is really specific. It says their original identities, Tano, Muskogee, Maya, you name it, were systematically erased,
Wow.
wiped out through a deliberate, centuries-long relabeling project.
Okay, so this isn't just theory.
No, not at all. The material really hammers this distinction between imposed labels, which are, external political tools, and inherent identity, which is tied to lineage and land. To really get this deep dive, you have to see this as a kind of identity theft that was codified into policy. It relies on historical records, demographic data, and international law to make the case for restoring that identity.
All right, let's unpack that. The source starts with what it calls the problem of identity theft. Why was it so important for colonial powers to replace a specific identity like Taino or Cherokee with something so generic, so non-place-based like Negro or Black?
Well, the core claim is that labels aren't neutral. They are social constructs, and critically, they are tools of control. If you look at the timeline the document cites, when Columbus arrived in 1492, he labeled the inhabitants Indios.
Right, Indias, people of the Indies. So they're geographically misplaced, sure, but they were still recognized as the people who belong there.
Exactly. They belong to the land. But the shift is what's critical. The label Negro starts appearing in colonial records somewhere between, say, 1510 and 1600. And it was applied to dark-skinned people regardless of their origin. It didn't mean a tribe or a nation. It meant a condition. And by the mid-1600s, Negro and slave become basically interchangeable legal terms. The identity marker shifts from native to property.
Wow, that's a huge legal transformation. It's not just a description anymore. It's a weaponized status.
Yeah.
But why? Why was this systematic relabeling project so necessary for colonization to actually succeed? It seems like so much work just to change a word.
Because control is all about the narrative. The guide breaks it down into 3 specific legal functions that these imposed labels achieved, all of them designed to secure power, resources, and land without a fight.
Okay, let's go through them. What are these 3 legal functions?
Function 1 is erasing indigenous title to land. Think about it. If the millions of people already living here could be legally reclassified as African or as, foreigners.
They instantly lose their inherent ancestral claim to the land.
Instantly. You can't claim sovereignty over a place you're legally defined as just visiting. It was the mechanism for legalizing mass land theft.
It's the ultimate jurisdictional trick. You change the victim's name, their inheritance just vanishes. Okay, what about labor? That was obviously the other big colonial interest.
And that's function 2, justifying forced labor. Labels like Negro or slave turned free, sovereign people into property. This legal fiction, this idea that a person could be chattel, made their exploitation seem, well, legally and even morally justified under that colonial system. It stripped them of personhood.
And legal standing at the same time.
Exactly. And then, if they managed to survive all that, what was the long-term control mechanism?
Function 3, I assume?
Function 3, controlling the narrative. By defining the surviving inhabitants as Africans or some other non-indigenous group, colonial powers got to write the history books. It justified continued colonialism by saying the original people have been conquered or just vanished, leaving the land open. It kept the survivors out of any international rights conversations later on.
The source talks a lot about the psychological impact of this. It's just hard to even imagine losing the root of your identity. To be told you're a foreigner and the only home your people have ever known.
It's profound. The guide discusses internalized oppression, deep identity confusion. People were cut off from their indigenous heritage, but often only had this vague conceptual connection to Africa, a continent many had never seen. That kind of rootlessness. That's the definition of generational trauma inflicted by identity theft.
That is a really compelling legal and political analysis. But the source promises evidence. So does the historical math actually back up this indigenous majority claim?
Okay, let's pivot from colonial policy to the hard numbers.
Yeah.
Because the source offers some really staggering demographic evidence to support this idea of an indigenous majority. We're usually taught that the Americas were, lightly populated. What were the real numbers like?
The source pulls together data from various scholars, and it shows the total pre-colonial population was massive, conservatively somewhere between 50 and 100 million people.
100 million people. That scale that's critical. That's not a few scattered tribes. That is a massive continent-spanning civilization.
Exactly. Larger than the population of many major European nations at the time. To put it in perspective, North America was estimated at 10 to 20 million, Central America and Mexico, 15 to 25 million, and the Caribbean islands, which are often said to have been emptied out early on, held 5 to 10 million people. Which brings us right to what the source controversially calls the transatlantic slave trade myth. The idea that indigenous people vanished and were statistically replaced by Africans. How does the source take on that deeply ingrained story?
It's about scale and timeline. If you look at the total number of Africans imported over 4 centuries of the slave trade, so from the 1500s to the mid-1800s, the estimates are around 10 to 12 million people total.
So on one hand, you have a pre-existing indigenous population of 50 to 100 million people, here for thousands of years, versus 10 to 12 million imported Africans over 400 years, even if you account for the Haitian population collapse.
Which was estimated at 60 to 90% mortality, mostly from European diseases like smallpox and measles, not just warfare.
Right.
Even then, the math doesn't support a total replacement. The source argues that indigenous populations were still numerically larger than the number of imported Africans for centuries.
So if the indigenous people didn't all die and they were the majority, how did the colonial records make them disappear? How does the source explain all the documents that say the vast majority of enslaved people were African?
And this is the absolute key insight. The source analyzes colonial records, Spanish caste documents, British slave inventories, French parish registers, and what they found was a deliberate merging of categories. Colonial officials were increasingly labeling indigenous survivors, especially darker-skinned people captured and enslaved locally, as Negro or African.
So they took the surviving native population, put them in the same legal box as the imported African population, and then just treated the entire group as foreigners without a land claim.
Precisely. The document points out these terms like country-born Negroes or Negro of the country. In a lot of contexts, country-born didn't mean born in the colony to African parents. It meant natives of the country. It meant indigenous people. By stopping the differentiation between enslaved indigenous survivors and imported Africans, the colonial system erased the legal distinction that tied people to the land. And that's how the indigenous majority vanished from the official census, making room for the replacement story.
That makes the relabeling project not just political, but it's statistical genocide.
Okay, so let's move from the historical problem to the solution the guide offers, which is sovereignty. Why is the goal sovereignty, the right to self-govern, and not just, say, better civil rights or anti-discrimination laws within the existing state?
This is a really fundamental legal distinction. Citizenship is membership that's granted by a state, like the United States. It comes with rights the state defines and can take away. You're working inside the state system.
Sovereignty, on the other hand, is the inherent right to govern yourself and control your own territory. It isn't granted by a government, it comes before it.
So if you're operating under a colonial label like African American, you're essentially asking the state for better citizenship rights. But if you reclaim your indigenous identity, you're asserting an inherent sovereign right that actually supersedes the state's authority.
That is the exact distinction the guide makes. Reclaiming indigenous status fundamentally changes the whole legal and political relationship. You go from being a subjugated minority asking for inclusion to a sovereign nation asserting pre-existing rights. And that's why the guide focuses so heavily on 2 powerful international legal frameworks that you can use once that identity is reclaimed.
Let's talk about those tools because they sound crucial for this path.
The first one is the ILO Convention 169 from 1989. This is a huge international treaty about indigenous and tribal peoples. And Article 3 is basically the starting pistol. It establishes that self-identification as indigenous is the fundamental criterion for determining your status.
So your personal declaration of identity is legally protected and recognized internationally, whether or not the country you live in accepts it.
That is such a critical point of empowerment, yes. Your identity is validated by you, not by the government that imposed the false labels in the first place.
Okay, and what's the second broader legal framework?
That would be the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, from 2007. This is the blueprint for how you exercise sovereignty. Article 3 establishes the right to self-determination, the right to decide your political status, to pursue your own economic, social, and cultural development.
And how does UNDRIP protect against more erasure?
While Article 8 is very specific about that, it mandates that states have to prevent forced assimilation and any actions that deprive indigenous peoples of their cultural values or identities. The guide argues that the ongoing use of these colonial labels is a continuation of forced assimilation, which makes it an active legal violation under international law.
So what does all this mean for you, the listener, right now? Why does claiming an indigenous identity versus accepting a colonial label like Black actually matter in a legal and practical sense?
Because reclaiming your indigenous identity immediately unlocks these specific rights. The right to self-determination, the right to collective land claims, the right to practice your culture without interference. These are rights that just aren't available to people operating under state-defined colonial labels like African American. It moves the whole conversation out of domestic civil rights law and into international human rights, into a nation-to-nation status.
To make this huge conceptual shift more concrete, we really need a specific example of this erasure and survival. The Caribbean is so often held up as the place where the indigenous population was just completely wiped out.
And that's why the guide focuses on the Taino people of the Greater Antilles, so Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Jamaica. The common historical story is that the Taino were extinct by the 1800s, just gone, wiped out by disease and violence right at the beginning of the colonial period.
And the source says that was a deliberate lie.
An essential lie, yeah. It was needed to let colonial powers keep ownership of the land. The source shows that Taino people survived, often by retreating into the mountains or assimilating on the surface, but their identity was systematically erased in the colonial documents through that relabeling project. If a Taino person had dark skin, they were just recorded as Negro or mulatto to fit the colonial property story. And just like that, they statistically disappear as a Taino.
It weaponized your appearance and your survival. If you made it through the disease and the war, your name was stripped and you were reclassified as a foreigner to be used for labor. What modern evidence is there that validates this resurgence of Taino identity today?
It's a combination of things. You have strong family oral traditions that survive despite the state-enforced amnesia. And crucially, you have DNA evidence. The guide cites studies showing significant indigenous DNA upwards of 15 to 20% in populations across Puerto Rico and other islands. It confirms that Tainos were never extinct. They were just submerged and relabeled.
This journey is clearly historical and legal, but it has to start with an individual act. So if you realize your identity has been stolen and relabeled, what are the immediate practical steps the source says you should take?
The guide is very clear. This is a step-by-step process of healing, of restoration. It starts at the most basic level. Step 1, self-identification. You state your claim, publicly and privately. Under ILO Convention 169, that self-declaration is valid, it's protected. It is an act of mental decolonization.
A statement of fact that then has to be backed up.
Which leads right to step 2, research and documentation. This means you compile your family history, you connect oral traditions to known historical data, and you document your lineage to strengthen your claim and understand which nation you connect to.
And the final step.
The essential third step is community connection. You have to build relationships within the indigenous community you identify with because indigenous sovereignty is inherently collective. You can't be sovereign alone. It's a right held by the nation. So the goal is to reconnect and rebuild that collective body.
We've spent this deep dive uncovering the systematic nature of colonial identity theft. We've reviewed the overwhelming demographic reality of an indigenous majority, not a minority, and we've identified the specific international legal tools like ILO 169 and UNDREP that are available for reclamation.
And the source really presents reclaiming indigenous identity as an act of profound healing and empowerment. It's about resolving the confusion and disconnection that was imposed by centuries of colonial policy. This journey to self-determination is ongoing, it's collective, and it really requires that historical resilience.
The guide argues that the colonial system wasn't some single evil conspiracy, but an emergent property. It was a toxic mix of economic interests, political structures, and religious justifications all coming together to achieve control. Knowing that, the ultimate question for you isn't just who are my ancestors, but if controlling the labels controls the historical and legal story, what power does creating new, accurate self-labels give you over the future narrative and your political destiny? Take the steps of self-identification and deep research.